Hello and welcome to Ag Talk. Today we're going to be talking about urban or rural farming. So stay tuned, we'll be right back.
Hey everybody, glad you could stay with us. So we're going to talk about farming in rural, urban, and
all the food in between.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So today we have a special guest, Dr. Julie Fox. I've known her for years. Julie, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Duane.
Julie is the director of, you'll have to help me,
Strategic Initiatives and Urban Engagement.
Thank you. And Julie, you've worked at the center, started at the center, and then progressed up. Tell us how you got started with Extension first, and how many years you've been here, and then we'll go into all the other topics.
Okay. Well, I was happy to join the team at the OSU South Centers in 1998, and during that time, I worked with a number of wonderful people on staff and in the community, and during that first few years, then I had the opportunity to continue my education and ended up completing my Ph.D. And about 5 years ago, I was fortunate enough to be able to move into a position in administration based out of Columbus, but I work statewide with OSU Extension now.
Awesome. So obviously, what you're doing now, or as you became a director, you started traveling all over the state, right? And you started working, is it just statewide, or you're actually working with states adjoining us, right, too?
Right. So the beautiful thing about Extension, as part of our land-grant university system, is that we have colleagues in a network across the country, really across the entire world. And so whether you're working from a rural area like we are in at the OSU South Centers, or you're working right there in the city at the main, at the Columbus campus, you really have access to a great network. And I feel again fortunate to have been in a rural area, traveling, urban, suburban, rural, urban on a frequent basis, and really getting to know people all along. All parts of Ohio, from the lake to the north, to the river here to the south, and everything in between.
So as we go, Julie, tell us about urban and rural. How do we define the difference, or do we define the difference? As farming seems to me is shrinking. Maybe I'll say the small farmers.
Okay.
Kind of shrink. A lot of farms I see now, used to when I grew up, are not there today. Are they becoming urban or rural farmers, or what are? How does this work?
Or is it the thing of scale? You can't make enough money unless you got a big farm, and the small to medium farms just can't make it.
Well, let's begin. Let's kind of break that apart a little bit about what urban, suburban, rural are. There are all kinds of formal definitions about what that might be. But if you travel throughout Ohio, you might see different parts of our landscape, whether you might live in a rural area and work in an urban or suburban, or vice versa. You might travel the other way. For work, for worship, for play and recreation. And so in Ohio, we have the benefit of having 15 different metropolitan statistical areas and roads that take us between urban, suburban, rural. So we have great access compared to, like in Illinois, we have a long state, and you have Chicago up here, and then a lot of disconnect. We're connected. And so it is, like you said, Mike, kind of like it's more of that continuum or scale of flow, not necessarily just on an economic basis, but kind of geographic basis. So then when you look at farming, what's urban or rural, and what farms look like today, there are some farms today that look just like they always have, and especially in the rural landscape. And then there are all kinds of new opportunities for farms to develop, urban, suburban, and rural. And so when we talk about farms, think of it as that scale of growing food. Have you guys ever grown anything?
Yeah.
Well, you used to have a garden, so what would be the difference between a garden and a farm, because you know you don't have a big scale of stuff in a city or
Right.
environment.
Well, they're all part of the food system. You know, whether some family are growing from themselves or for their extended family or growing for themselves as neighbors. Some trends that we see are community gardening, where people come together, and even on campuses where the students have farms and they each have their own plot. And we see that again, urban, suburban, and rural, where people want to come together and really grow food that's authentic and familiar to them. And it's an opportunity for people of all ages to come together and better connect with what food means to them. So while growing up, I grew up in northwestern Ohio where it's flat, large farms. I've lived in the West where you have, ranches. And so I think we all need to rethink, really, what does it mean to farm or
So
garden?
farming is gardening.
It's
all
an element
included.
of that. It's
Yeah.
an element of that.
It's
Some
just
people,
either huge or small. It doesn't matter. You're still farming.
you're part of that
Yes.
food system.
Yeah,
Yeah, and we see a lot of connections in the whole food system, whether it's the production of food, the selling of food, or sharing of food, the processing of food, eating and enjoying food. We see those connections across Ohio. So someone might grow food in a certain part of Ohio and share it locally, or maybe it's part of the regional food system. Or in the southeastern area here that we're sitting in today, people might be growing food, taking it into the city, making connections and sharing with the community there, either through a farmer's market or selling directly to restaurants and grocery stores there, and then bringing some supplies and resources back that are inputs into the food system.
Okay.
And so the food that we take for granted so often
Yeah.
every day has a story behind it. The story of, those connections of people
Of where it came
growing
from.
it. And, yeah.
So, how did you get started into this? Was it already started and you walked into it, or is it something you kind of developed at the university or
Or
in the state? I
what
guess?
would your job be as far as, I guess, promoting all this? Is that what you're doing?
It's a piece of it. So OSU Extension is part of OSU's College of Food, Agricultural, and Environmental Sciences. And while we're part of that college, we have connections across campus with many of the different colleges and units. And so as I look at my individual position, I also see that great network that we have of community-based extension groups in each of the 88 counties. And they share that interest of really helping with the food production, helping with those food connections, and whether people are looking at it from an economic standpoint, a social and environmental standpoint, really helping that community see what the food system means to them. There are food policy councils across the state and across the country where people are coming together and bringing their different perspectives to say, you know what, I don't grow food, but I control policy or ordinances in the area that might impact those people who want to have a community garden in this community.
Okay.
And so I think as everybody kind of looks at their role, so if I look at mine, I think that was a question that you asked. So I started in this position about 5 years ago, and with a focus on helping Extension look at how we can respond to the urban influence. So while some of my work is directly in the cities, we really are interested in that connection between urban, suburban, and rural across our great state of Ohio.
Okay.
And so we're learning about that here in Ohio, and also there's a National Urban Extension Leaders Network. And so we're working nationally because this urban influence, the shift in population where people live and often work, isn't just a growth and a trend that we are seeing here in Ohio. We're seeing it across the country and across the world. So we're really learning together so that we can make the most of those connections. And so as we make decisions about things about the economy or socially or in the environment, we see our local picture and then we see that bigger picture.
Now you're talking about, I don't know, government or controls. Is there anything that prevents someone from growing anything anywhere or using different materials? Like, I was in a conversation about raised beds, and they had, I guess it came up about railroad ties. So I said that might be a bad idea because of the creosote in it. So is there any regulations governing any of that, or?
Right, so there are some regulations, and a big piece of what we do is education. And so people are resourceful. You know, as you're growing food, you want to be resourceful, you want to bring together things that you have. And so it's a combination of learning best practices. And so our extension educators in each of the counties can really help address those issues. And for some, like in the city, you might, or even in rural areas, you might be dealing with immigrant and refugee populations and helping them really localize what does their local food system look like and how can they do that maybe in a safer way from the production to the processing. You know, similar type of thing with food processing. We talk about food safety, whether it's the production or the processing aspect. And a few years ago in Fairfield County, we had the case at a church event where there was botulism. And they, you know, had been canning food the same way forever, but things have changed. Our water quality has changed. The ingredients of some of the vinegars that we use has changed. And so the university and OSU Extension can really help you keep up to date on what's current with the production, the processing, the storage and consumption of food to keep it safe for everybody. I know, things we take for granted.
Yeah, you don't think about that at all.
Or soil quality. When you have your soil tested, it's not for quality necessarily, is it?
Well,
I mean, there are the ingredients, but if you know, if you moved on to a place that might have been used for something else, you know, and has some bad things in the soil, would you pick that up if you had a soil test?
so there are different kinds of tests that you can do for soil, and it's a little bit different based on where you are doing the soil test, and sometimes you're intentionally looking for something like in a brownfield area, like is there contamination here, which you wouldn't maybe see in another area. So there are different types of tests that you can do. So you want to make sure it's safe, and you also want to make sure it's really nutrient rich. You know, science continually looks at what can we do to make it safe and have good nutrition to take it, you know, through the plant, if it's plants that you're growing, or you know, agriculture, food and agriculture is very broad. When you think about urban agriculture, you think about trees, you think about ornamental landscaping, you think about pollination, and so I think of food first because it's a big part of my life. But and most people think about that growing season. But agriculture here in Ohio, it's diverse, it's rich, and really encompasses a lot of different things that impact our daily lives.
Yeah. I never really thought about agriculture being, like you said, in the city or just maybe outside of the city and stuff. So,
Yeah,
you
so
know,
like
I never
in my-
really called that farming.
Right.
You know, I called that, you know, community gardens or a hobby or something.
Right.
But, you know, you put it in a great perspective of, yeah, it's really growing the same thing.
Just a continuum.
Yeah. It might be growing it in a condensed and
You get a pot
population,
of strawberries or something.
Yeah.
You can have, or peppers. you
So
know.
where does a farmer's market fall into play, Julie? Is it part of this as well, or are we just talking about growing the food, and then marketing it is something else?
It's all part of the food
It's all-
system.
yeah.
It's very connected. Some people grow and sell right there in their own community. Some people grow and contribute food in their own community. But a farmer's market, it's about that connection between the producers and those that want to, you know, purchase it, whether they are buying something that's ready to go and already made, or they're bringing together those fresh ingredients that they're really excited about, especially those seasonal things that we have here in Ohio. And so the farmer's market is part of the local economy and regional economy. It's also social, part of our social fabric, where people really like coming together and learning about that connection with food. So whether they're urban, suburban, or rural, many people have stepped away from really knowing where their food comes from, appreciating what it takes to grow food, and looking at it not only from their own perspective, but from other people's perspectives. So farmers markets are growing across the state in all types of communities. Community gardens, you look up in Cleveland, I think they have, I don't know, almost 200 or more
Really?
community gardens. And you talk about, if you want to go to that farming specific questions, the urban farms are growing in Ohio, in urban areas. They look a little bit different because of the availability of land. But in Columbus now, there's 40 urban farms. And in Cleveland, there's even more than that. And it's not just unique to Ohio. And so people are looking, like if they want to make a living doing farming in an urban area, it might look different. It might look like the integration of vertical farming. It might be, you know, really niche marketing. To go back to your question about the, you know, where farmers markets play. So it's that combination of, you know, your role in the food system, whether you're a consumer, a producer, or processor, or reseller, and.
Now, when you talk about a garden growing in the city, and is that typically owned by the city, or is it owned by maybe a group of people? How do they define who's whose? I mean, and I'm sure that's part of that policy and things that come about. Somewhere either the city
landowner
has to
says you
give
can
it to
use mine.
a group of people. Is that how that works? Or
So people are getting creative.
Yeah.
In some cases, it's private property. So,
Okay.
so just like a farm here, you buy a farm, you produce, you sell, you're an independent operator. Now they've come together to have an urban farm network. And sometimes they come together as a cooperative. I think maybe you've talked about that even on the show before.
Yep.
And in other cases, it's not private land, it's public land. And it could be either a rooftop
Okay.
of a building. It could be a place where there used to be a building and the building is no longer there. And so they're trying to reuse space that is already there. It could be part of a church.
Oh.
So
okay.
churches, neighborhood groups have taken part of the neighborhood or city or county property. Again, these food policy councils are really helpful in bringing together the resources and connecting people who want to grow food and be a part of the food system. And so if you look at Columbus and Franklin County, for example, the city and county came together for a local food plan.
Okay.
And it's really nice to see that comprehensive approach. We see that similar type of thing happening in Athens and Pike County. Again, it's not urban, suburban, or rural. It's happening across the state. So the land is owned by, it depends on the kind of the
varies.
context. Right,
Okay.
schools have them, school
Yeah,
gardens.
schools got them too.
Universities, we
starting
have
out.
student farms and student gardens.
Yeah, I even see that maybe some high schools are
Yes.
starting to do this. So I think it's a great thing.
How do
whether you're-
community gardens work as far as, you know, the big cooperative things where you might have an empty lot? Like
this
who
row's
controls
mine and-
who coming in and just grabbing stuff? I mean, you
Well,
hate
security.
to go and farm it
Security would be a question.
and then leave and come back the next week and everything you thought you were going to have is gone.
Mike, that's a natural question, but the really cool part about community gardens is they're part of that community. So it reflects the community. The community takes care of it like they take care of each other, and they help govern it. There are different models, again, but kind of like where it's based. But you maybe like I was really surprised to see that
Nothing happens.
it's not a factor like you think it would, because
Really?
when you think about community garden, it's not just
would think it
people
would.
sharing space. It's about people coming together and being a part of that, and really getting together and saying, you know, what is important to us? Do we want to also have, you know, selling of it here? Do we also want to be able to give some of that away? And how does that look? Making sure that in the community that you share best practices, because if you're treating your field one way or your little plot one way and I'm treating mine another, you know, in the large farms out in the rural areas, we are concerned with drift, right?
Yeah.
So
And
you think
you
about
could
that
be-
area,
that's-
and you think,
Absolutely.
right? And so it's really
Wow.
that shared commitment to being a part of something. It's not just I'm leasing this little section or I was given this little section. It's you're part of a community.
Julie, I think you got some slides that we might look at.
I
some
do,
different
yeah.
things.
We've talked about a few things, but I wanted to share a few
yeah.
images and
I know
a few
you-
thoughts.
Yeah, I know you had some graphs and stuff as too.
It's interesting, you know, as we look at kind of the need to talk about the food and agriculture system. Food insecurity in Ohio, 1 in 7 people are food insecure, which is higher than our national average. You know, that need of really helping people get connected. And food is a way to bring people together. I found myself trying to intentionally get together with people who aren't like-minded, that might think differently than I do. But when we come together over food, we can have some conversations and really make a connection. And we better value kind of where we come in the food system, but also value the perspectives that we bring to other conversations too. And so, you know, for example, I'm a vegetarian, And many of my friends and colleagues are not. They're hunters and gatherers. And we don't judge one another. We talk about what's important to us, and we really respect one another. And food, if you have that kind of conversation about food, you can take that further and have conversations about other topics as well. And so there's the need. There's lots of, really, I could have gone on bullet by bullet, but just, that idea of food insecurity and that value of connections. And then as you look at some of the trends, I think maybe we've talked a little bit about those, but the demographic of farmers is changing. In rural areas, the age keeps going up, right? And we really see young people getting more involved in urban, suburban, and rural areas in the food system in some way, whether it's the production or those connections as part of that food system. And so we have the really trying to see how we can work together, not just urban, not just rural, but really working together to recognize what it means to have a garden, have a farm, and be a part of that. While, our United States Department of Agriculture, USDA, might define farming this way.
Right.
We look at our own perspectives and our own communities, and it might mean something else.
And say it's really this way.
Right.
Yeah.
I think the schools need to do a little bit more in educating people what things are. We were at the store, and the guy that was running the checkout didn't know what some of the vegetables. He didn't know what a coconut was.
Interesting.
Like, come on, you're old enough. You should have seen this at some point and known, what the different vegetables are.
Right. Well, a couple of things there. One, you're looking at 3 gray hairs here, and so part of it is age and what we grew up with familiar with, and some of it is also people come to Ohio from many different backgrounds. It's a very, internationalized state.
Yeah, true.
But there's I'm glad you brought it up, because there's a great farm to school movement here. And it's not just schools offering more local food, but also making the connections so that they better understand what types of food. I know in one school system, they had broccoli. And the parent called and said, very disturbed about they made the student eat a tree.
A
because
tree?
it was like a little tree to them.
Oh, okay.
That's what my kids used to call it.
Right.
Yeah.
And so it's education within the schools and with the community, the parents and family. I think we all are interested in having a safe, healthy food in our homes.
It seems like it's changed
schools.
a lot since I was little, and my grandfather, was a farmer, kind of a subsistence type farmer, not a big farm, and to now, which I don't grow anything really. And then my kids, who are more removed from that. So just in 3 generations, we've just gotten off the farm, and now they probably don't have a clue.
Yeah, it helps. I think that's part of that resurgence of the container gardening, the raised beds, bringing it into suburban and urban areas so that they have not just the education, but that great experience of having fresh food right there. And some of it's local and seasonal, and some of it's also just trying to expand people's access to healthy food. So
it's a lot better because things that were picked 1,000 miles away were picked earlier, and they didn't have time to ripen on the vine. And when you get that right off the vine at the peak,
right,
it's a lot better.
Yeah.
Right, and access to different types of food. Sometimes if you grow up in a poorer neighborhood, you have kind of limited access to types of food. So I think schools and others are trying to bring that diverse,
bring that back.
Bring all the colors of the plate, of the, to make for a healthier food system. But if you've ever seen a young person eat, like a ripe tomato or a ripe orange for the very first time that never had one, you're like, all the stuff I've taken for granted.
Really?
Yes.
Huh.
Yeah, one of the things,
I never think about that.
One of the things, if one of our friends goes south, we tell them pick up some peaches.
Yeah.
Because the peaches we get here are
That's
not the
completely-
same as the ones that come off the vine in Georgia.
Oh, seasonally now, to my friends who have orchards, seasonally, if you haven't had a peach from some of the orchards around here, they'll make your mouth water just like those Georgia peaches.
Right.
Yeah. Apple's the same way. It's, I was just at a local apple orchard, and pulling an apple right off a tree is completely different than just going and buying it. Even if it's that apple at the store, it's like, it's just so much different. It seems like it.
My mouth is just watering.
It does, but.
Yeah, we've talked a lot about fruits and vegetables and growing again, but and orchards. But again, Ohio's agricultural landscape is very diverse, and I know there's been a lot of interest from livestock growers
That was going to be my next question.
okay.
We've only talked about vegetables. And
Yeah.
does the animal farming go into the city also?
It does.
Oh.
There's actually there's an urban shepherd program outside of Cleveland where they do the grazing of the sheep during the season near the city, and then the shepherd takes them back
Out through the
afterwards.
winter?
If you look at different immigrant and refugee populations, they really appreciate the value of having fresh livestock, and so some of that's happening. So again, to those Colleen policies and ordinances, can you have a chicken in the city? Can
Yeah.
you have
Chickens and
bees in the
goats.
city? Yeah, sure.
Oh.
And so the communities are coming together,
Yeah.
urban, suburban, and rural, to say what do we value, and how can we come together to have that, rich, diverse opportunity in our food system, in our agricultural system.
That's really interesting. I never even thought about animal farming
Yeah.
in a city, if you would.
Right.
A lot of people are taking off with the chickens,
Do you?
whether
yeah.
eating them or the eggs.
right.
Do you think as the population seems to continue growing, are we going to have to be doing more and more of this?
It's going to become a necessity
Yeah.
rather than a
I mean,
luxury.
and this is, looking into the
Right.
future. Is this going to be more of the way that we're going to see farms? Because we're turning current farmlands into cities or small towns, if you would. Do you think this is going to be the trend of turning a normal farm into an urban farm or a community farm?
I think that
I
farming.
guess is what I'm thinking.
I think that farming can be a rich part of all of our communities, urban, suburban, and rural. It might look a little bit different, but it is an important factor so that we can feed the growing population here in Ohio as well across the country and the world. And it's also really a valuable part of community. Whether it's a formal community garden or people coming together at a farmer's market or better understanding the connections throughout our food system.
Do they, or have they started doing greenhouses?
There are, and the university actually will be building a new indoor growing facility to continue that research. Some people have indoor growing for a variety of things. Some people do aquaculture indoors.
Oh, that's another interesting.
Aquaponics,
aquaponics.
thank you. Yeah,
Aquaponics.
aquaponics and
Yeah, we've
hydroponics
got that.
indoors. So
Yeah.
lots of opportunities.
That's really interesting. Aquaponics is, and I think that's something that'll come about too as we go. So, Julie, I know we just got a couple more minutes left. Is
1
there
minute? Yep.
any last things that?
I do. I encourage.
Yeah.
Thank you. I encourage everyone, and I do it. I have to remind myself to look at your perceptions about food and agriculture. Really reconsider that, how you see the food and agriculture system, and then look at it from other people's perspectives. Urban, suburban, or rural, or grower, marketer, processor, and look at how you might be able to make a new connection. And I guess gain a better awareness and appreciation and connection across food and agriculture in Ohio.
Interesting. I think I've learned a lot today with just a better definition
Yeah,
of farming, if you would.
knowing the possibilities.
Yeah, and the future. I guess you could think of it, looking at it differently in the future. So,
Thank you.
yeah. Julie, I'd love to have you back again sometime.
Love to be back.
Mike, you want to send us off, please?
Okay, well, thanks everyone for watching, and we'll see you next time on AGRI-TALK.